The deal was signed quietly, but its consequences will be anything but. Just days after the most furious diplomatic row in NATO's 77-year history, the global balance of power has shifted without a single shot being fired. While Washington remained locked in internal arguments over tariffs and loyalty, Brussels and New Delhi completed a move that effectively redraws the map of the world economy. This morning, Europe and India finalized a strategic trade agreement that creates a new economic artery across Eurasia, deliberately bypassing the United States. It is not symbolic, it is not temporary, it is operational, and it signals something far more serious than a trade realignment. It signals that America's closest allies are no longer waiting for Washington to stabilize. They are building a future without it. The narrative that NATO is broken is no longer a theory or a warning. As of today, it is a functional reality. The United States is withdrawing from 66 international organizations. Tariffs of over 40% are now hitting its closest allies, and in response, those allies have not chosen confrontation. They have chosen replacement. World leaders are not issuing bans on Washington. They are executing a soft ban, a strategic redesign of trade, diplomacy, and security that slowly removes the United States from the center of global decision-making. The system is not collapsing, it is reorganizing, and America is no longer at the core. To understand why European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi are smiling in New Delhi today, it is necessary to understand why political leaders in London and Berlin are seething. The catalyst was not a policy document. It was an insult. Last Thursday, during an interview on Fox Business, President Donald Trump made a statement that stunned allied governments across Europe. In an attempt to justify his isolationist policies and renewed threats to leave NATO, he claimed that America's allies had stayed off the front lines during the war in Afghanistan. He stated that nations like the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, and Poland stayed a little back, while American troops carried the burden of combat. The reaction was immediate and explosive. For the first time in decades, a British Prime Minister publicly rebuked a sitting U.S. president with visible anger. Sir Keir Starmer described the remarks as frankly appalling and deeply insulting. But the outrage did not remain rhetorical. It was driven by numbers, and those numbers told a different story. The United Kingdom lost 457 service members in Afghanistan. Canada lost 158. Germany lost 59. Denmark, relative to population size, suffered some of the highest casualty rates in the entire coalition. These were not symbolic deployments. These were frontline operations in Helmand Province and Kandahar. These soldiers fought and died alongside American Marines, under the same fire, in the same dust. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius broke diplomatic protocol and addressed the issue directly on national television. Speaking on public broadcaster ARD, he demanded a formal apology from the U.S. president. He stated that it was not only inaccurate but deeply disrespectful to dismiss the sacrifices of Allied soldiers. To rewrite that history, he said, was simply not true. This was no longer about hurt feelings. It was about trust. NATO is not held together by weapon systems or funding agreements. It is held together by belief. The belief that the United States respects the sacrifices of its allies. The belief that Article 5, the promise that an attack on one is an attack on all, is more than a legal phrase. It is a moral contract. When the President of the United States publicly diminishes the deaths of Allied soldiers, that contract fractures, not legally, but psychologically, and in geopolitics, perception is power. To European leaders, the message was unmistakable. If American leadership no longer acknowledges their blood, it will not defend their borders. And that realization triggered a strategic shift that had been quietly developing for years. Europe stopped treating Trump's presidency as temporary turbulence. It began treating it as permanent climate change. The result was acceleration. Negotiations that had dragged on for decades suddenly moved at record speed. If NATO was becoming unreliable and if the transatlantic trade bridge was collapsing under steel and auto tariffs, Europe needed an alternative anchor. They turned east. For nearly 20 years, the European Union and India had discussed a potential trade agreement. talks repeatedly stalled over market access and regulatory barriers. India had long been one of the most protectionist economies in the world, but the geopolitical environment had changed. By January 27, 2026, the logic had become unavoidable. If the United States was retreating into economic nationalism, Europe would expand into strategic diversification. And so, while Washington argued about loyalty, Brussels and New Delhi signed what European officials are now calling the most significant trade agreement in modern history, not because of its symbolism, but because of its scale. The agreement establishes a free trade zone covering more than 2 billion people. It eliminates tariffs on 96% of European goods entering India. This level of access is unprecedented. India does not traditionally open its markets, but this time the doors were not opened, they were removed. For Europe, the benefits were immediate and structural. For India, the timing was perfect. Both sides were responding to the same pressure, the same instability, and the same conclusion. The United States was no longer a reliable economic center. This deal was not a partnership, it was a pivot. And it marked the beginning of a world where the future of global trade, security, and diplomacy would be negotiated without Washington at the table. Not through confrontation, not through war, but through ink. The economic architecture of the EU-India agreement reveals why this deal is being described as a historic realignment rather than a simple trade pact. This is not a narrow sector agreement. It is a comprehensive integration of two economic systems that were previously separated by some of the highest tariff walls in the world. At the center of the agreement is market access. 96% of European exports entering India will now face zero or near zero tariffs. For decades, India had protected its domestic industries through some of the most restrictive trade barriers among major economies. These policies kept foreign competition out and domestic prices high. That era is now over, at least for Europe. Nowhere is this shift more dramatic than in the automotive sector. Until today, European cars entering the Indian market were subject to import tariffs of up to 110%. This made vehicles from Germany and Italy luxury items available only to a tiny elite. Under the new agreement, those tariffs fall to 10%. For companies like Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW, the implications are enormous. These firms are currently facing heavy tariffs in the United States, particularly in the electric and high-performance vehicle categories. Their access to American consumers is shrinking, just as production costs are rising. The Indian market, by contrast, offers a rapidly expanding middle class of over 400 million people, with rising disposable income and increasing demand for personal vehicles. In strategic terms, European automakers have effectively replaced the American consumer with the Indian consumer. The same transformation applies to agriculture and manufacturing. Indian tariffs on European wine and spirits were previously as high as 150%. These tariffs are now being dismantled. Machinery tariffs of 44% are removed. Chemical product tariffs of 22% are eliminated. Pharmaceutical trade barriers are gone. This means European producers can now sell into India at scale across sectors that were previously closed or commercially impossible. In return, India gains tariff-free access for 99% of its exports to the European Union. This includes textiles, leather goods, jewelry, processed foods, and industrial components. These sectors employ tens of millions of Indian workers and represent the core of India's export-driven growth model. The European market now becomes India's primary economic outlet, just as the American market becomes less predictable. The timing is not accidental. Indian exporters are currently facing new U.S. tariffs ranging from 25 to 40%. These measures were introduced as part of Washington's reciprocal tariff regime. At the same time, European exporters are facing a 15% tariff wall in the U.S. auto sector and increased steel restrictions. As one door closes, another opens. This creates a classic strategic formation. Europe and India hedge against American unpredictability by building a self-sustaining trade corridor. Their supply chains begin to integrate, their logistics systems align, their investment flows redirect. This is not competition with the United States. It is substitution. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen described the agreement as a signal that rules-based cooperation still delivers meaningful outcomes. But the underlying message is more direct. Europe no longer needs Washington as an economic anchor. This concept is known in geopolitical strategy as strategic autonomy. For years, it existed mostly as rhetoric within European policy circles. It referred to the idea that Europe should be able to function independently in matters of defense, energy, and trade. Until now, it remained theoretical. The EU-India deal turns strategic autonomy into operational reality. Beyond trade, the agreement includes extensive chapters on defense cooperation, cybersecurity, maritime protection, and supply chain resilience. These are areas traditionally coordinated through NATO and US-led institutions. Europe and India are now coordinating directly. They are discussing Indo-Pacific maritime security, they are sharing cyber defense frameworks, they are aligning industrial standards and advanced technologies. These discussions used to involve Washington. They no longer require it. India, for its part, is also repositioning. For the past decade, India had been a central member of the Quad, a strategic grouping with the United States, Japan, and Australia designed to counter Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. But as U.S. trade policy became increasingly aggressive and visa restrictions tightened, India began to diversify its alliances. The logic was simple. Dependence on a single unpredictable partner is a strategic vulnerability. Europe offers India something the United States no longer does: stability without coercion, market access without tariffs, cooperation without ideological conditions. The result is a recalibration of global power flows. Trade routes begin to bypass American ports. Investment capital shifts toward Eurasian corridors. Diplomatic coordination happens outside U.S.-led frameworks. This process is not visible on television. There are no headlines announcing it, but its effects are measurable in shipping volumes, capital flows, and institutional participation. At the same time, the United States is moving in the opposite direction. President Trump has withdrawn from 66 international organizations, citing globalist agendas and national sovereignty concerns. He has launched an alternative diplomatic forum called the Board of Peace, which includes Russia but excludes several traditional Western allies. In parallel, the U.S. has expanded its tariff regime to cover major portions of global trade. The stated goal is industrial reshoring. The unintended consequence is systemic isolation. The world economy is not waiting for the United States to return. It is reorganizing around new centers. The EU-India agreement functions as a new economic circulatory system. Capital, technology, labor, and goods flow between two massive democratic blocs, with minimal friction and increasing institutional alignment. This system does not collapse global trade. It replaces its core. And for the first time since the end of World War II, the central artery of global economic power does not pass through Washington. It runs across Eurasia. The agreement establishes a free trade zone covering more than 2 billion people. It eliminates tariffs on 96% of European goods entering India. This level of access is unprecedented. India does not traditionally open its markets. But this time, the doors were not opened. They were removed. For Europe, the benefits were immediate and structural. For India, the timing was perfect. Both sides were responding to the same pressure, the same instability, and the same conclusion. The United States was no longer a reliable economic center. This deal was not a partnership, it was a pivot, and it marked the beginning of a world where the future of global trade, security, and diplomacy would be negotiated without Washington at the table. Not through confrontation, not through war, but through ink. The consequences of this realignment are not abstract. They are already visible inside the United States economy, and they carry long-term implications that extend far beyond tariffs and trade balances. President Trump has argued that economic pressure will force global companies to return production to American soil. He refers to this strategy as a great rebuilding. In July 2025, he announced a $550 billion investment pledge from Japan, presenting it as proof that tariffs are working. But economists have repeatedly warned that investment pledges are not the same as investment outcomes. These commitments are often conditional, flexible, and highly sensitive to global economic conditions. When markets slow, pledges are delayed. When costs rise, projects are canceled. The structural reality is simpler. When the United States imposes broad tariffs, prices rise domestically, imported goods become more expensive, supply chains become less efficient, inflation accelerates, and while some manufacturing jobs may return, they return into an environment of higher costs and reduced export access. The greater risk is not inflation, it is exclusion. For decades, American economic dominance was built on access to global markets. American farmers, manufacturers, and technology firms relied on open trade corridors. They sold into Europe, Asia, and emerging economies with minimal barriers. That system is now fragmenting. The EU-India agreement introduces a process known as trade diversion. This occurs when countries shift suppliers not because of quality or price, but because of tariffs. When two partners remove tariffs between themselves and a third country maintains them, the third country loses market share by default. The impact on American agriculture is immediate. European farmers can now export wheat, dairy, and processed foods to India without tariffs. American farmers face import duties. When an Indian distributor chooses between French wheat and American wheat, the decision is not ideological, it is mathematical. The cheaper product wins. The same applies to soybeans, corn, machinery, pharmaceuticals, and industrial equipment. European firms gain first-mover advantage across the fastest-growing consumer market in the world. By the time the United States attempts to negotiate its own agreement with India, market access will already be saturated. Distribution networks will be established. Brand loyalty will be formed. Supply chains will be locked in. The shelves of the future will already be filled. This is how economic power erodes, not through collapse, through absence. By 2030, projections indicate that EU-India trade volumes will double. In contrast, US-EU trade is expected to shrink by more than 15% due to the ongoing tariff conflict. This is not ideological decline. It is statistical decline. Superpower status is not lost in a single decision. It is lost when other nations stop needing you. And this geopolitical fracture cannot be understood without addressing one of the most surreal yet strategically serious developments of the last year, the Greenland crisis. President Trump has renewed his interest in purchasing Greenland from Denmark, citing national security and Arctic access. Denmark has refused, as it has in previous years, but this time the refusal triggered direct economic threats. Trump publicly suggested imposing tariffs on Denmark, a NATO ally. The issue is not land ownership, it is geography. As Arctic ice melts, new shipping routes are opening, untapped natural resources are becoming accessible. Control over Greenland offers influence over future global logistics and energy systems. But by threatening Denmark, the United States signaled something far more damaging. It demonstrated a willingness to coerce allies over territory. For Nordic countries, this crossed a psychological threshold. Sweden, Finland, and Norway began reassessing the nature of American leadership. The United States was no longer seen as a guarantor of security. It was increasingly perceived as an unpredictable actor with territorial ambitions. The Nordic bloc responded by accelerating integration into European defense structures and reducing strategic dependence on US-led NATO mechanisms. This did not require formal withdrawal. It required trust withdrawal. And that same pattern is repeating across Europe. Intelligence sharing is becoming selective. Defense procurement is becoming regional. Trade architecture is becoming Eurasian. This is what a soft ban looks like. No treaties are broken, no alliances are dissolved. But decisions stop flowing through Washington. Instead, they flow around it. The climax of this transformation is not economic, it is symbolic. For the first time since the end of the Second World War, the major democratic powers of the world have constructed a long-term strategic framework that excludes the United States by design, not by accident, not by necessity, by choice. Europe and India did not sign a deal to punish America, they signed it to survive without America. And in doing so, they created a new center of gravity. Donald Trump promised to put America first, and in a narrow sense, he succeeded. The United States now stands alone at the front of its own economic system, first in tariffs, first in withdrawal, first in isolation, but last in the room where the future is being negotiated. There is no official ban, no document removing the United States from NATO, no announcement ending Western cooperation. But in geopolitics, power is not defined by legal membership. It is defined by relevance. When your allies build the largest trade agreement in modern history without you, when they restructure global supply chains around you, when they coordinate defense strategies without you, when they demand apologies for your treatment of their fallen soldiers, then the question is no longer whether America left the world. The question is whether the world left America. The EU-India deal is signed, the tariffs are active, the trade routes are shifting. And for the first time in over a century, the United States is no longer the unavoidable center of global power. It is simply another nation, standing outside a system it once built. And for the first time since the end of World War II, the central artery of global economic power does not pass through Washington. It runs across Eurasia. The agreement establishes a free trade zone covering more than 2 billion people. It eliminates tariffs on 96% of European goods entering India. This level of access is unprecedented. India does not traditionally open its markets, but this time the doors were not opened. They were removed. For Europe, the benefits were immediate and structural. For India, the timing was perfect. Both sides were responding to the same pressure, the same instability, and the same conclusion. The United States was no longer a reliable economic center. This deal was not a partnership. It was a pivot, and it marked the beginning of a world where the future of global trade, security, and diplomacy would be negotiated without Washington at the table, not through confrontation, not through war, but through ink.